right?
Yes, it's a great big one.
Yes, and they're not real busy.
Oh, really?
But I'm sure they're getting busier, but sure, initially.
Well, how's everybody today?
Great.
All right, good.
Happy May.
Happy May. That's right, May Day.
May Day.
Dance around the maypoles. And where's our maypole around? That's right. It's very good. I'm glad you're here as we wind this study up. It's sort of sad to leave this book, but I hope that it stays with y'all in good ways and something you can look back on. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Be present, Lord Christ, and give us that joy that comes from knowing the new life and the eternal life that comes from you, the joy that comes from humility and humor, acceptance, forgiveness, gratitude, compassion, generosity, and perspective. We give you thanks for Desmond Tutu and Dalai Lama and Mr. Abramson, that we may continue to be nourished by their words. In your son's name we pray. Amen. Abrams, that's the good one. All right. So there's a two-sided sheet in front of you. The first part of it is just a little bit of a recap, in the sense that we are working about transforming our minds a lot. And part of that comes from this Romans passage that we say, do not be conformed to this world, but be renewed by the transforming of your mind. A lot of these practices are about renewal and about focusing and training ourselves in a new way. I'm not going to talk too much about the 8 pillars because we're going to do that as we flip the page over. But just as reminders, last week we talked about the last of the obstacles, almost the last of the obstacles, joy, envy, and suffering, and adversity. And there was a lot about getting perspective with those things when we are envious of stuff. One of those was, I think, Desmond Tutu saying, you might be envious of somebody's large house. Then you might say to yourself, it's just the 2 of us. Why do we need 7 rooms? Why do we need all those kind of things? So that's about perspective. And even if envy and jealousy do feel like sort of natural human emotions, they're not ones that are virtuous emotions. And so we're trying to gain some perspective on those. Humility is part of that. And even gratitude is part of that. These pillars sort of get peppered in here is all we're doing. We're grateful for the things that we have. We're not necessarily aspiring to the up the ladder side. And also part of the humility is not just remembering to look up this ladder of status, but look down and have compassion on those who are as well who are suffering. And that has to do with some hospital bed situations where a person maybe have been lamenting his or her own ailment, but then closing in and just thinking of himself or herself. Whereas you might say, wow, this hospital is full of lots of people. And who else is suffering? And who is caring for them? And what about all the hospitals in the rest of the country or the rest of the world? And also it's not a way of saying yours is unimportant. It's not saying yours is the only thing that matters. But there are other people there. So that is one of the ways to remember once we have that level of compassion. And we'll talk more about that today. That section ended with someone who had a brain injury, long rehabilitation. One of the first words he said to his son was not, oh, woe is me, but this was part of my curriculum. This is part of life for curriculum. And we had some joy practices, inviting you to either the mudita practice, which was about overcoming envy, or the Longzhong practice. Did anybody have any success with those or anything they'd want to be able to share? Okay. Good morning, Ginger.
Good morning, Rob.
You're sounding better.
Yes, I'm better. Just still
Good.
got a little fever.
Oh, I don't like that. All right. Well, we'll pray for that fever to be gone.
Good.
All right. So flipping the page over, just what we want to talk about any day, right? Illness and death. Favorite subject. Well, of course, these are obstacles of joy. Because when we are sick, even a long sickness that keeps us sheltered in, or a deeper sickness that's like cancer or ALS or something like that, it's very hard. It's very hard to be with somebody who's going through that. Sometimes it even feels harder on the person because you're helpless. There's nothing I can do. Versus the person who is suffering, who's maybe come to terms with it, where family members haven't come to terms with it. So there's all of that goes on with it. And one of the things I liked about this chapter, if we look real quickly to page 161, is the difference described here between healing and curing. If I get to the page, I can tell you more exactly where it is. Sort of the bottom half of the page, in the middle of that second full paragraph, he made a powerful distinction between healing and curing. Curing involves the resolution of the illness, but it was not always possible. So maybe you have bronchitis and you take the antibiotics, you run its course, and you're cured. There's no sign of it anymore. Healing, he said, was coming to wholeness that could happen whether or not the illness was curable. So rheumatoid arthritis, for example, may not be curable, but there is a sense that can happen with what's the healing with that? What's the coming to terms with it, the humility, the perspective, the gratitude, they're all other type of things. So it's a different way of facing a situation like that. And again, that comes from part of the piece that is the perspective. And then on 163, and this is a lot of what Allison and I deal with in terms of pastoral situations, and you all have dealt with too, when it comes a time where you know the illness is indeed going to lead to death. And it may be something that is 2 years out, it may be something that's unknown, it may be something that's very short. But part of my pastoral thinking and process and prayer at that point is, even as the body may get weaker, that the faith remains strong. And that's part of this leading up to death, because as the Dali, or as somebody says on page 163, the very top of it, perhaps death and the fear of death is truly the greatest challenge to joy. Well, when we are dead, it doesn't really matter. But it is the fear of its approaching, of the suffering that often precedes it, and ultimately the fear of oblivion and the loss of our personhood that frightens. Now, this is the Dalai Lama speaking here of oblivion. That's not necessarily the Christian perspective. But what comes afterwards, none of us actually physically know in terms of having been there, what heaven is like, what afterlife is like. And even with that in front of us as the happy moment or the joyful outcome, between this moment and then, whether for us it is 2 weeks or 2 years or 2 decades, there is that understanding of what is it? And do I fear death? Or do I have some perspective, as they go on to say, we all die. It's something we all have to face. We all have to get in touch with in some way or another. And do we let the fear of it overcome us? And I think that's the way it is with all these obstacles. Are we letting any of those obstacles overcome us? The envy, the suffering, all those type of things, or are we able to gain some perspective and approach them with faith, but also with joy? Yes, one day I may die, but boy, what a wonderful life this is now, and I'm going to enjoy every minute. And part of their point in this chapter is sometimes those people who are faced with death and know that something is coming, all of a sudden become even more alive because they're not taking each day for granted. Where it's easy, I've certainly taken days for granted, moments for granted, when I just think, oh, I got plenty of time, I can make that up, all those other kind of things. But that's not what it is. Going on from that passage, many psychologists say that the fear of death lies behind all other fears. And even some historians of religion argue that religion arose to try to solve the mystery of death. That's one way to think of it. It's not one that I agree with, but I understand where that comes from. Skipping down to the paragraph that begins, when many people think about death, they are very, very afraid. Usually, I tell them that you should accept that death is part of your life. There is a beginning and there is an end, as you mentioned. So once we accept that this is normal and that sooner or later it will come, our attitude changes. Some people are embarrassed when asked their age or pretend they are still young. This is silly, says the Dalai Lama, deceiving oneself. We should be realistic. So let me stop there for just a second and see if you all have a perspective either on illness or death that you would like to share, or a question that you have.
I think it's one of the hardest things because we live in a kind of a death-defying culture, an age-defying culture. We just, all things are possible through plastic surgery or medicine or good health or exercise or whatever it is. And that's a harder conversation to have about death and dying. I guess more of an observation.
Sure.
I surely don't have an answer for that. And I don't even know how much that invades my own thinking about of what am I afraid? Is that a fear of death? Certainly, I worry about what's going to happen to my family or my husband, or what more likely I think about if he dies first, right? Like that's the kinds of things I think about. How do you? So I've walked with people. You've walked with people at the end of their lives, either planned for or unexpected, and it never feels like I love the burial liturgy because I think it expresses what I can't in terms of what I believe about God and what I believe about salvation. So I'm glad for that. I'm glad to lean on that. I'm glad to have the prayers that are there. But I'm not sure how much they go toward relieving fear. You know, we did a funeral on Friday, and I could see that fear in the eyes of the family members. They were grateful for what we did, but it's still there in the back of their. And how does it keep us from joy? Because there's no. It seems like it does. It might be the biggest one to overcome, as I say.
Dealing with a couple pastoral situations now. One of them is someone who is just really frustrated, a little depressed, and would rather die. And many times a week says, I'd like to die, I'd like to die. And then she went to get her COVID boosted shot. So she's in between this, I do, but I don't, I do, but I don't. And it's just it's a really hard place to be with her. It's a hard place to be with her spouse. In what is it? And the other thing dealing with is a person who is truly up in age, and family, some of the families think she is scared to die, and that's what's keeping her alive, because she's still trying to make peace with something that happened here on earth, and she's maybe afraid to meet her maker and what would happen when that is. Now, I don't know any of the details with it, but I can also feel that realness, and this is where pastoral is saying, this is what grace is all about. All these scriptures that you've heard, all these songs that you've heard have been part of, and all this faith is exactly part of why Jesus says, do not be afraid. Peace I leave with you, my own peace I give to you. And it is that deep trust in that, even though we're not 100% sure of all of those things, because we walk by faith, not by sight.
That is the most troubling thing to be with someone who has a regret, or what they perceive as regret. You can do all the things I know to do, the pastoral things, the absolution, forgiveness, anointing, and still know that they have a great deal of regret.
Right.
And
I think this book is actually an anecdote to that type of thing, because I think we all have regrets. But the more we learn to have perspective on those regrets, you go on a vacation, you have family over, whatever else, everything goes well except for two things. What do you remember? The two things. These are the regrets that we have. Why do we do this to ourselves? And this book is part of that. I'm grateful that all the family was here. They want to be perfect. The turkey may have been overcooked, but we were all together and we made it work in the midst. And that is a debate about not letting those regrets overwhelm us and having more of a sense of joy that, hey, this went really well. Were you gonna say something? Barbara looked like you were about to say something. You're welcome to.
I have a question.
Yes.
What part does redemption or redeeming, trying to redeem oneself from those regretful acts
Mhm.
play in the preparation for the end?
A huge part. I mean, I think that's what all of the
Yeah.
the little bit of teachings and healings that Jesus is doing all along the way. Even the people who were healed of their blindness or their hemorrhaging, the ultimate end, in my opinion, was not to stop the hemorrhaging or stop the blindness. The ultimate goal or thing was to see the power of God working in their life, so they would turn toward God and start taking those steps. And some of our our emotional healings are the same. That we really have to think that, yes, even though I feel the burdens of these sins and they're heavy on me, God, your love for me is greater than my sins. If we really feel like we have an unforgivable sin, that's another way of saying God's grace isn't sufficient for me. That somehow I'm greater than God, that my sins are great. Please. I mean, that's the humility part. And that's what we just have to say. If we really believe in the beauty, omnipotence, and everything of God, then my sins, as much as I feel as bad they are nothing compared to the grace that is coming to us. And so that's part of the redemption that comes along the way. And humility, I mean, all these pillars really are part of that. Having some perspective, humor, being able to laugh at oneself, acceptance of a situation. Yes, I've got this illness, or I've got this situation, or yeah, there are always going to be people richer than me, a lot richer than me. I got to accept that. And if I keep climbing the ladder and losing my soul or whatever else it is, and maybe even adopting some illegal practices, that's not helpful in the end. That reminds me of the story of the jailer who was beaten by his Chinese captives. And the main thing he didn't want to lose was not his life, but he didn't want to lose his honor and his sense of their humanity. Keeping his humanity was the most important thing, even if the man died. He was not going to turn to be a hater of the people who were doing this to him. And that blows me away. That blows me away, that kind of perspective.
You know, Rob, it's hard to get rid of those feelings of transgressions of the past, and they live with you, and you think about them as you go to sleep, and that's what I struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how can I give that to the grace of the Lord, that those things are behind me, and
Right.
I struggle.
I hear you, and that's thank you for sharing that. And it is hard, and part of it is even the piece of humility. Maybe when we talk about that in just a little bit, is saying, being able to say you're sorry, and maybe that's to yourself, maybe that's to them, but being able to forgive yourself is a form of love one another as I have loved you, or love your neighbor as yourself. That God is forgiving you, and to enter as a spiritual director, Michael Battle once said to me, think of forgiveness as a river. And the river is flowing there, and you have to decide whether or not to get in it. And part of getting in it for you to be forgiven also means that then that forgiveness is flowing to other people in your lives. You can't be in the river asking for your own forgiveness and not dealing out forgiveness. It's like the Lord's Prayer, right? Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. You can't do one without the other. Jesus says that again and again and again. But allowing, just over time, with that humility, with that acceptance, yes, that's happened. Yes, I can't change that. Yes, I'm pledging to take a new step and a better step every day, and help me to be at peace with the past, and help me to be at peace with the grace that's coming. But it's hard. It's hard.
You know, Rob, I think a lot of that comes down to control. We all want to think that we are in control of our own lives for sure. So if we make a mistake, yikes, I must have been wrong.
If somebody else was responsible for this, it wasn't me.
I
right.
You know, I
Yeah.
must be not in control, and that's a difficult thing to admit. So, you know, I think sometimes owning our humanness
Right.
and allowing ourselves to be human and God to be what? God, how about that?
Mhm.
Um, it makes it easier. You know, I was not capable of doing that, but oh my gosh, I'm forgiven. Now, if I want to dwell on it, it's like living in that same mud that I'm embarrassed about. Get up and get out of it and stand up. He's got you.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. So here's another kicker, Rick. This one, 165, fourth full paragraph down. So it is important that in our daily meditation, we should continue to think about our own mortality. There are two levels of impermanence. At the grosser level, life keeps on changing and things cease to exist, including us. At a more subtle level, even every single moment, everything is changing, and something science is able to show us is happening, even at the atomic and subatomic level. Our body is constantly changing, as is our mind. Everything is in a constant state of change. Nothing remains static and nothing remains permanent. And that's the Buddhist perspective. If you've been in having exposure to Benedictine theology, part of what St. Benedict says in his rule is the same type of thing. Always have your mortality in front of you. Just don't think of yourself as permanent, not in a morbid kind of way, but just in a realistic kind of way. You need to have that right when you're speeding down the road. I'm going 95 miles an hour. My chances of dying are increasing. My mortality is in front of me. If I'm going 25 miles an hour on an interstate, also my chances of dying are faster. All those type of things. So you have to think, what am I doing? What am I doing with the food I put in my body? What am I doing with the practices that I have? If I'm a couch potato, if I'm over exercising, all those other type of things, I'm not permanent. And that's a perspective part, and that's also a control thing. No. So again, that's part of the practice is remembering our humanity. And I love at the bottom of 165, nothing exists independently. Nothing exists independently. We are connected to each other in so many ways, connected to the trees, connected to the animals, connected to so many things. There is no truly independent person. Even if you go off into the woods and live all by yourself, someone probably either planted the tree that you made your house out of, or you got those boards, or the metal pot that you took out there, or the clothes that you took out here. There is no truly independent way of being. And so that's an important part. And on page 166 in the middle, before we move on, Jimpa, who was the translator for the Dalai Lama, explains that there is a profound teaching in an ancient Tiberian master. The true measure of spiritual development is how one confronts one's own mortality. The best way is when one is able to approach death with joy. The next best is without fear. And the third best is at least not to have regrets. So when we do have regrets, maybe the motivation is, let's not have any more regrets, or let's live in a way to reduce those regrets. So maybe you say to a friend when they're complaining about X, Y, or Z, some regret they have, lovingly say, well, what about next time? How can you make it better next time? So there's not a regret or a loss of that.
Perhaps my Catholic upbringing, but you know where I've gotten stuck on this very thing before is that you think I'm not even deserving of forgiveness because I hurt this person or that person, and I think that then we're diminishing what God is capable of.
Right. Right. That's a form of self-centeredness.
Absolutely. Which then is an awakening because you don't want to be that either.
Right.
So,
That's right. That's right.
but it makes me think of, and what book just came to mind, and tell me if this was what it was about or not, because I read it years ago. Your God is Too Small, J.B. Phillips. Do you know that book?
But only by reputation.
Yeah, so I can't remember if that was, one of the points of it, that it, to get better, I need to allow my God to be as big as he really is. And not to me to be bigger and think I've got to find a way to do it.
And the Psalms, sometimes, I think it's the Psalms paint the opposite picture of that. When the person says, how small I am, who are you to consider me? And when you think about the expansive universe and all the planets and all the galaxies and all the everything, here we are, and God is mindful of us. That's the opposite side. That's sort of the awe piece, and that's the gratitude piece. So if you transplant the gratitude or stick some gratitude in there as a pillar to hold up yourself, like, thank you for creating me, thank you for forgiving me. Let me not take this forgiveness for granted. That's one of the parables Jesus taught, right? The guy comes in, oh, forgive me, he owes the master so much money he could never repay it. Yes, you're forgiven. He goes out the door and strangles the neck of the young little guy and says, you owe me this, pay me back. And the master comes and says, that's not how it works. Yeah. Sure, not how it works. So it's really having that gratitude and then being able to share it and see that same need in other people that they have. Like, what a different thing would have been to say to that other guy, you know what? Yes, you're forgiven. And then they go home and say to somebody, yes, you're forgiven. And they go to say, and yes, you're forgiven. And that's how part of the pay it forward, the spreading it really does make a difference. So it becomes a way of life and not this sort of closed in way of being.
I saw God as too small and as someone who, what a great guy. I would have hired him to work for me. And then I realized he was running the business. But it took me a while to see.
I'm reminded of that Brenton, I think Steve prayer, oh God, my boat is so small and you see it so well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we turn then, and this is going to be a whole lot quicker than I'd like it to be, to page 193, you really get to the section of the book, which is stepping back and looking at the 8 pillars of joy. If you haven't read this, or if you have, you'll see that some of the stories are somewhat repeated along the way as he tries to make the point of these. So the first 4 he calls the pillars of the heart, and the second 4 become the pillars of the mind. And I've given you some page numbers on the cheat sheet that if I don't get it through today, or if you want to go back and find what might be a nugget or what's something that defines those type of things. So let's just walk through those real quickly. First on page 200 with gaining perspective, which is also described as reframing something. The main bulk of the paragraph, I'm just going to go ahead and read this to drive it home. When we have a wider perspective, we are also less likely to spend our time lost in self-referential thoughts, ruminating. That's sort of what I was saying about, that's a form of self-centeredness. We're just ruminating on ourselves. We are caught on a cycle of things that's a whole lot bigger. So where do we get our perspective? Jimpa offered another thought experiment designed to take us out of our self-absorption, one that the Archbishop described using when he was in the hospital being treated for prostate cancer, and that the Dalai Lama used when he was doubled over in pain from a gallbladder infection. Think about where you're suffering in your life, and then think about all the other people who are going through a similar situation. There's the perspective. This perhaps is quite literally the birth of compassion, which means suffering with. The incredible thing, said the Dalai Lama and Archbishop pointed out, was not that this suffering with others reminds us that we are not alone, but actually lessens our own pain. This recognition of our interdependence begins to soften our rigid sense of self, the boundaries that separate us from others. And the Dalai Lama said it early in the week, if, on the other hand, I relate to others from the perspective of myself as someone different, a Buddhist, a Tibetan, and so on, I will then create walls to keep me apart from others. So a little bit of the compassion pillar in there, a little bit of the perspective. How do we gain perspective on something? So then flipping to 212, the other pillar of the heart, humility. Second half of the page. Now, we should also realize that the recognition of our own limitations and weaknesses can be very positive. This can be wisdom. If you realize that you are inadequate in some way, then you develop effort. If you think everything is fine and I'm okay just as I am, then you will not try to develop further. There is a Tibetan saying that wisdom is like rainwater, both gather in the low places. There is another saying that when the spring bloom comes, where does it start? Does it start on the hilltop or down in the valley first? Growth begins in the low places. So similarly, if you remain humble, then there is the possibility to keep learning. So I often tell people that although I'm 80 years old, I still consider myself a student. Really? Says the Archbishop? And so it goes on. But I love that image, because that's certainly the way it is here, right? When things are blooming now, up, you get up higher, it's not there, or it's coming in and it comes in later. That just makes so much sense that when we're in that humble stance, that low place, we're in the learning, developing place. If we try to jump up, we never really have that learning. We're on the top. So that again, Jesus talks in those kind of language. Those who want to be my follower must be a servant, and servant of all. I have come not to lead, but to serve you. That's when he's washing their feet. Or when the story of his going to the Pharisee's house, and he doesn't take the highest seat, he takes the lowest seat. Now, if he's offered the highest seat, good for him. If not, he has started off in that place. So this piece of humility is a way of doing. I can understand how that builds joy, because you begin to see things in the world that you may not see yourself and even others. So real quickly before we move on, what about perspective and humility as pillars? Those sort of you understanding, hopefully, how those begin to help buttress our joy, this joy in life. In other words, pride doesn't. In other words, single-mindedness doesn't. But humility does, and perspective does. I'm certainly learning a lot by thinking about these pillars for sure. Humor, the quote on 219 that I thought made sense, and this sense of laughing at oneself, not in a way that's meant to be sort of false humility, but in a way that, yeah, I'm just human. That's the way it is. I mean, of course, it's not a laughing matter not to know where your next meal is coming from, he says in the middle of 219. It's not a laughing matter when you get up in the morning and you don't have a job. Yet it was those people who quite frequently were the ones who formed part of the crowds that used to come for the political rallies, the funerals. They were the people who were able to laugh at themselves. And then their laughing at others would be less malicious. They weren't particularly number one in God's garden, but they were able to laugh at life and all its cruelty and uncertainty. Humor really is saving grace. Maybe that's where we get the term gallows humor, right? When someone is headed in, it's about death. Oh, I just have to laugh. Sometimes you have to laugh so you don't cry, and I also get that. But there are a lot of jokes. And again, it's laughing at oneself, not laughing at someone else who is in a particular bad situation. Anybody have an example of that they'd like to share, of a person or even of yourself? You have permission for just a moment not to be humble and share a story of yourself.
I do think humor lets us hold things lightly. It gives us the ability to maybe have a wider perspective when things are heading in a certain direction, inevitable or not. You can humor or somebody's ability. I know that has lightened so many situations where someone is willing to make a joke, or not at someone else's expense, but yet see some irony sometimes, it's like that, or maybe something that does help us, so to say. life is bigger than even the most horrible thing that we're confronting. There is more life here. And humor is just like, to me, a sign of love. It's just a sign of love. You know, my niece had a baby early last Friday. We were going for a baby shower in Charleston. That's where I was gone last weekend. Instead of a shower, we had a baby. And the baby's 3 or 4 weeks early. And, you know, it's scary. But I think having us all agree. My sister and brother and I are terrible people because we have to joke about everything. And so I hope that our presence made it produce less anxiety from our niece. You know, to talk about our own experiences with birth and our own babies. Because it does need some lightning to say things won't be okay. I mean, I don't have any idea when things are going to be okay or not. I don't know. We don't know us. So far, everything's.
The other examples of things, even like you might see on Saturday Night Live, you know, where there's a tense political situation and there's some satire that comes with that. So we're laughing at democracy or whatever. Sometimes it's poking fun at people. So that's not what you're talking about. And the other thing that's just sort of whimsical that comes to mind is at General Seminary, we had this thing called The Follies, and it was a sort of a comedy show. I would make fun of you know, you're at seminary, you're learning all this very serious church stuff. You're pious, you're processing, and you're whatever else you're doing. Then you turn around and then you just start laughing at tradition or vestments or all these other kind of things. And it's just a great relief to say, okay, yes, this is church and this is important, but let's not take ourselves so seriously that everything has to happen. Okay, it's just all right. Yeah.
I thought about Bill Howard's memorial service last week, and how much of that service was humor-based, and great stories about him and funny stories about him. It was a celebration of him, and the joy came out of laughing.
Yes. And that laughter was about the good points of life and not over-focused just on the death and the gone and the missing. So yeah. Good example. And then on 225, to the point of acceptance, you see that first full paragraph on 225, acceptance, whether we believe in God or not, allows us to move into the fullness of joy. It allows us to engage with life on its own terms rather than to rail against the fact that life is not as we would wish. To Sharon's point. It allows us not to struggle against the day-to-day current. Dalai Lama had told us that stress and anxiety come from our expectations of how life should be. When we're able to accept life of how it is, not as we think it should be, we are able to ease the ride and go from the bumpy axle dukkha, with all its suffering, stress, and anxiety and dissatisfaction, to the smooth axle sukha, with this great ease, comfort, and happiness. And that was a reference to an earlier part in the book as well. So many of the causes of suffering come from our reacting to the people, places, and things and circumstances in our lives rather than accepting them. Now, this is not, I think, saying let's accept racism or let's accept those kind of things, but you accept the fact that, again, like with wealth, there'll be some who are poor and some that are rich. With racism, some who get it and some who don't. And some who say we're going to do something about it. And not just to rail against it. When we react, we stay locked in judgment and criticism, anxiety and despair, even denial and addiction. It is impossible to experience joy when we are stuck in that way. Acceptance is a sword that cuts through all of this resistance, allowing us to relax, to see clearly, and to respond appropriately. What do y'all think about
I
acceptance?
found myself in that spot for a couple of hours this past weekend. And I have a good friend, Russ, who passed me at least 6 times and said, breathe, Sharon.
Mhm.
Might have been a little much, I'm sorry.
No, it really helped
Mhm.
because you really do get caught up and stuck in it and feel miserable, and you
Mhm.
need to remember things like that.
Well, it's so easy, I think, I'm a big control person and I see something wrong and I think that's not fair. I need to go fix it, or I need to go fix that, and I need to go fix this. And like, you don't have that ability. You gotta work on what you can work on, and you know, the whole serenity prayer thing.
Sure.
And work on what you can, and accept that things are not always going to be fair.
Right.
But you can work on what is in your wheelhouse.
And what usually gets me out of that is my humor.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get in touch with it. So,
And these two men, I mean, the Dalai Lama has to accept the fact that he's not getting back to Tibet,
Yeah.
to the Chinese room, but he is his culture. He can try to sustain. It's not that they stopped trying to act that way. We're trying to make things happen, accepting, oh, well, I guess all this will just disappear then in this generation. Okay, that's not accepting, that's abdicating. But accepting is the fact to say, okay, we're not in Tibet anymore, but we can still come here in India and try to keep this going in this way. And the same thing with Desmond Tutu. He didn't accept the racial divide that was in South Africa. But the Truth and Reconciliation is part of listening to the stories, is accepting that this happened, telling the truth, and then moving on from it, but leaning in and engaging in those ways. So it's not rolling over kind of acceptance. We don't accept domestic violence. We don't accept those kind of things, but we do have to understand that some people are struggling and what, if we're in a position to help, to be compassionate, that's where these pillars work together. We're not individual silos. They're all holding up the same thing. Somebody would like to say something? No? Okay. I'm not sure I can speed through all of these in 15 minutes, so I'm going to do my best. On page 2, this might be 232 that I typed in backwards. Or 233, actually, it should be 233 at the bottom of the page. Forgiveness, the Dalai Lama continued, does not mean that we forget. You should remember the negative thing because there's a possibility to develop hatred, and we mustn't allow ourselves to be led in that direction. So we choose forgiveness. So this is the choice. This is the training of the mind piece. The Archbishop was also clear about this. Forgiveness does not mean you forget what someone has done, contrary to the saying, forgive and forget. Not reacting with negativity or giving in to the negative emotions does not mean you do not respond to the acts or that you allow yourself to be harmed again. Forgiveness does not mean that you do not seek justice or that the perpetrator is not punished. So again, it's not just letting it go by, but you can forgive the person. Terrible, something happens, someone's been convicted, they're in jail for 25 years, justice is being done, all this type of things. At some point, you have to forgive that person. Or actually it becomes something in you that ends up being the negative thing. You're building up to hate, you're not letting go, and you're not accepting the fact that you might be in jail for 25 years. There's some things you may have done wrong that God could easily point out along the way if you wanted to. So that's being, again, in the stream that is forgiveness. 242, gratitude. In the middle of the page, gratitude is a recognition of all that holds us in the web of life and all that has made it possible to have the life that we have and the moment that we are experiencing. Thanksgiving is a natural response to life. It may be the only way to savor it. Both Christian and Buddhist traditions, perhaps all spiritual traditions, recognize the importance of gratefulness. It allows us to shift our perspective, as the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop have counseled, toward all we have been given and all that we have. It moves us away from the narrow-minded focus on fault and lack, and to the wider perspective of benefit and abundance. You may remember a sermon that I've preached here before about, is the glass half full or the glass half empty? And my perspective on that, it's all the way full. It's just half full of water and half full of air. It's not empty on it. So again, it's a matter of seeing, what can we be grateful for? When it's raining, We want the sun. When it's sunny, we want the rain. Well, can we, on a rainy day, be grateful for the rain. On a sunny day, be grateful. All those types of gratitude that come with it. And again, has some of that perspective. Again, I'm not sure how they divide these between mind and heart. They both seem to be mind and heart things at the same time. But anyway. On 252 is one on compassion. I know I'm going very fast, and I apologize for this. This is in the middle of the page, in the middle of the paragraph. Compassion is what connects the feeling of empathy to acts of kindness, generosity, and other expressions of altruistic tendencies. The biblical Hebrew word for compassion is rachamim, comes from the root word for womb, rechem, and the Dalai Lama often says that it is from our mother's nurturing that we learn compassion. He also says that his mother was his first teacher of compassion. It is from being nurtured and in turn nurturing our own children that we discover the nature of compassion. Compassion is in many ways expanding this maternal instinct that is so pivotal to the survival of our species. I just like the way they put that. When we are nurtured, when we're understanding someone else is looking out for us, it actually helps us to look out for somebody else and to pass it along that sense of compassion. And lastly, generosity. And I put these two in bold, so I remembered I would get to these two on 274. The Archbishop and the Dalai Lama were describing a special kind of generosity, the generosity of spirit. The quality they have, both have perhaps more than the other, is the generosity of spirit. They are big-hearted, magnanimous, tolerant, broad-minded, patient, forgiving, and kind. Maybe this generosity of the spirit is the truest expression of spiritual development. What the Archbishop has said, it takes time to become. The Archbishop had used a beautiful phrase to describe this way of being in the world, becoming an oasis of peace, a pool of serenity that ripples out to all of those around us. So it's not just about giving money, because you can give money and still be heartless. But it's about the generosity of spirit. What's behind it? Again, that's the story of the widow's mite, right? She gives the last of what she had. That's not something about her spirit, not about her wallet. And that's part of what Jesus is getting to, is how do we give? What Jesus himself did, emptying himself completely, coming from heaven to earth, was an act of generosity. So you can see, all of these pillars in one way or another reflecting our Lord. We do wish maybe we knew the humor a little bit more. There are a couple of times that are sort of humorous we look at. But that's why I love also the sculpture of Jesus laughing in our courtyard, because we know that he laughed. And maybe the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John didn't have a developed sense of humor, so we can write in some of those parts into our story. But in closing this, I do hope that having these focuses, having these practices, just like you have to develop your muscles, we talked about last time, if you want them to be strong, if you just sit around, nothing's going to happen. But if you get up, if you exercise, if you're chopping wood, lifting weights, walking, doing push-ups, whatever else, you're working on resistance and you are working to get stronger. These practices, heart practices, mind practices, are ways working to get stronger, and the end of that strength is having this sense of joy. Not that all these things aren't going to still be happening in the world, that's the acceptance piece, but that we can find joy even in the midst of some really adverse times, some of which it feels like we're living in now. So I hope this has been a good study and a good book for us. If any of you want to continue, like just a little group that would talk about these things, get together once a month or something like that from time to time and do it. Sharon led something like that a long time ago and is doing it again, right? With breathing underwater or thinking
I really
about it.
love to do breathing
Yeah.
underwater and start a group, yeah.
So what Allison and I are offering is we can get that together. So let one of us know if you'd like to continue this, or think about it from time to time, and we'll find a way to do that for those who are interested. Thank you very much. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks,